What's up everybody and welcome back to the workshop. Now, as you guys just saw, I stacked this here billet with alternating layers of 1095 and 15 and 20 high carbon steel. I'll be turning this billet into a Mosaic Damascus pattern and then turning that into a chef knife. I think it's gonna be super cool and I can't wait to get started. Thank you guys so much for joining me. Let's go ahead and start the forge so we can get this billet nice and hot. So now that the billet is cooling down in the forge, we're gonna let it take a nice, slow cool down just to get it ready for cleaning it up, cutting it, and restacking it. Now, after it's cooled down, we'll go ahead and chop a little bit off and reveal what that pattern looks like. I'm very curious. Now, in theory, it should look like little C's. We followed this process to hopefully get that. We started off with 16 layers of straight stacked steel. We then cut in our corners with the squaring dies. After that, we flipped it 90 degrees and forged it on this axis. So we should have a pattern that looks like this. All those layers should now be rounded off. But we're just gonna have to wait and see while that cools down before I cut into it and give it a nice little test etch. So I will see you guys when that's cooled down. Unfortunately, I forgot to turn on my microphones in this next part. I was still getting used to them, but you can really see those C's popping through after the test etch. It worked out very nicely. And from here on, it was time to clean them up and get them ready for our second forge weld. With our billet cooling down in the forge, we're gonna give it a nice slow cool again, and then we are just going to repeat that same cut and clean up process as we did on the last go around. And those pieces will be cut right now. So we have our 4 sections cut, and now real quick, I wanna give them a nice little test etch to see what kind of pattern we are working with right now. So we're gonna go ahead and soak these in some gator piss real quick to reveal that pattern. So here is that pattern really showing through. I think it looks super cool with all those little waves in there. I think it's gonna turn out awesome once we re-square it. Now I am thinking about adding some more layers into this bad boy, doing a 15 and 20, 1084, and 15 and 20 stack in between each one of these segments here, just so when we go to re-square it, those lines will do something a little bit different and add a more in-depth pattern into this mosaic billet. But now that we know what the pattern looks like, we can go ahead and get these cleaned up and restacked. And again, with some fun little editing, that will be done right now. So here is our billet welded up together. Now earlier I did misspeak on 2 separate occasions. I'm using 1095, not 1084, and I did 1095, 15 and 20, and 1095. I flipped it earlier. But now that that's out of the way, we can go ahead, light the forge, and get this monster billet stuck together. So with our billet now squared to 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches, we're gonna go ahead and move to our next step, which will be completely re-squaring that billet. Alrighty guys, so we let our billet cool down nice and slow. We are now going to hop over on the bandsaw and get this bad boy cut into 4 more sections, and then get the pieces prepped and ready for our 4-way weld. I'm very excited with how this is going, so let's get back to work. Now, with the pieces cut, I got a little excited and went ahead, cleaned them up on a 220 belt and gave it a nice little test etch. You can see that pattern coming through. I think it looks like a flower, and I'm very excited about that with those waves in between each petal. I am through the moon with how this is turning out, and I want to say a quick thank you guys for following along in this process. I am just so excited that I get to do this and have your support along the way. Now, our next step will be to clean up these pieces so we can get them welded together. So to the grinder we go. our billet has now been drawn out to 3/4 by 1.5 inches. I'm not sure if that's the optimal billet size for cutting our tiles, but we're gonna go ahead and try it out. Now before we can cut the tiles, we're gonna clean up all of the faces and make this a pristine looking billet, just to ensure everything is nice and clean and as square as possible. Really quick, I got a little excited and went ahead and cut off one of the end pieces on that billet. I then test etched it. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see, I don't know if the camera's gonna pick it up, but I can put a picture of it right here off of my phone. I am so stoked with this pattern, and I think it looks awesome, and I cannot wait to see it on a chef knife. Now we do still have lots of cleaning up to do on that billet to make sure there are no delaminations in our tile welds. So let's get back to that. Now we have our billet nice and clean. We can move over to the bandsaw to get these cut at a 35-degree angle and get our tiles nice and prepped and ready to be stacked for our final forge weld. Now I am cutting these tiles at about 1/2 inch. I think that should give me plenty of material to draw out and forge the chef knife. In between every cut, I did measure out that the gauge was still cutting at 1/2 inch. You know what they say, measure twice, cut once, but in this case it was measure 18 times, cut 9. I am very glad that I took the extra time to make sure that all the tiles were being cut at the same size, just to set myself up for success in the future. Now that we have all of our little tiles cut, we can go ahead and do some light cleanup on the belt grinder. Now I don't have a surface grinder or surface grinder attachment, which would be very helpful. So we're just gonna have to try our best to make sure everything stays square and has nice, good edges, so there are no gaps when we go to weld these up. Now I'll also be making another piece of sacrificial steel that will provide us a jacket around the billet when we go to forge weld it. I'll talk more about the reasoning and the process for the jacket when we get there, but for now, let's head over to the belt grinder. For every tile, I went very gently on a used 120 grit belt, just cleaning off all of the edges, making sure all the surfaces were clean, and double checking in between to make sure that everything was as straight and in line as possible. With all the tiles cleaned up, I then moved over to getting the top of our jacket cut out of some mild steel, and then over to the belt grinder to get everything cleaned up so that it would have nice forge welds. Now, when stacking the tiles for our billet, you want to rotate every other one. So 1 will sit like this, and then 2 will get flipped, and 3 will lay like that. 4 gets flipped, 5 lays straight down, 6 gets flipped, 7 lays straight down, 8 gets flipped, and 9 lays straight down. What that does is it ensures that you have the pattern running evenly along both sides. For the tile welds, I did switch my welder. I usually run flux core through it, but I switched over to MIG. It just provided me with a much cleaner weld. The flux core throws a lot of splatter everywhere, and I wanted these welds to be as clean and nice as possible. Now, what you guys just saw me do is a no oxygen weld. I tack welded all of my tiles onto the sacrificial mild steel, and then went back in and completely filled that seam with MIG bead to prevent any oxygen from getting in those tiles and creating delaminations when we go to forge weld. Now I will be giving it a nice little oil bath, and the oil should also help prevent any oxidization during the forge welding process. So we're gonna go ahead and light the forge, get that heated up while this is taking a nice little bath. I won't lie, I was very nervous doing this forge weld, but I tried to make sure and take my time and go nice and slow to ensure that those tile welds set very nicely and very cleanly so we wouldn't have any problems later on. After a few passes under the press, I'm fairly confident that those forge welds have stuck. So now what I'm gonna do is go at it with an angle grinder and try and grind away all of that MIG bead on the outsides of our billet. We don't want any of that mild steel or anything showing up on our edge. So I'm gonna go ahead and grind that all away. This was quite the process, but I am very glad that I took the time to grind out all of that MIG bead and have a nice area around the edge of that billet. Now I didn't see any problem areas or delams around the edge, so I was pretty certain that it was going to be smooth sailing from here. Using a jig that I made up to try and gain some width on my billet. One thing I did learn when making Mosaic is the billet before the tile weld, you want to make the width of the blade you plan on making. Mine was 1.5 inches. I should have made it 2 inches. I wanted a 2-inch chef knife, so that would have saved me some material in the long run. But here I am isolating the tang with the smaller dies on top of the press and the larger dies on the bottom. This helps isolate the material but leave the spine straight, as most chef knives have a straight spine. I plan on doing a full tang chef knife. Now I don't see a lot of full tang Mosaic, but I wanted to try it out and see how it would work. Huge shout out to my little brother. He came in pretty clutch and came out and helped me do some hand hammering to try and widen the blade. We have our billet very rough forged out here. Now with Mosaic Damascus, forging the profile of the knife would really distort that pattern, so I'm leaving it a little rougher than I usually would, and I'm just gonna grind the profile in to save that pattern from distorting. I think we got really good forge welds all the way through, didn't have to go back in and touch anything up, but here is our billet so far. So we're gonna let it cool down and then get to grinding the profile in. So we have our blade rough ground, and I'm pretty confident that I ground away all of that mild steel jacket. So I went ahead, made some marks for our pinholes and tapped those in. We can go ahead and light the forge and make this knife a normal knife. Normalizing is a very crucial step in the blade smithing process. Heating the knife up to critical temperature and slowly letting it cool down to the ambient temperature helps refine the grain structure and reduce any stresses caused by forging. Now, what's really cool about normalizing is you get to see a sneak peek at what the pattern looks like. I am just so excited that it worked, and I'll give you guys a sneak peek when we pull this out of the forge. Kind of see that pattern popping through. I think it turned out absolutely amazing. I can't wait to get this bad boy finished up and do our etch. I think that's gonna look just absolutely insane. Once that cools down, we'll go ahead and drill our pinholes and keep on cracking. With our holes drilled in and our normalizing cycles complete, it is time for the heat treat. So we'll be taking up to 1,475 degrees Fahrenheit and holding for 15 minutes. All right, so the knife has now been soaking for 15 minutes at 1,475 degrees, so we can take it out and quench it in our oil. Now the kiln has cooled down enough that we can put the knife back in for our tempering cycles. Those will be done at 400 degrees for 2 hours. So we are out of the temper now, and our blade is still straight as an arrow and looking good. We can now hop over to the grinder and grind in our bevels, and then move on to so much hand sanding. So without further ado, let's get after it. With the blade covered in blue Dykem, I'm using a drill bit to scribe the center line for our bevels. When grinding my bevels, I like to start off with a worn 60 grit belt, knocking in a 45-degree angle at the edge of the knife. I then slowly work that bevel towards the spine and work to catch up with that initial 45-degree angle on the edge. Once I get to around the halfway point of the knife, I like to start to increase my grit, going from 120 to 240, then to 400, and from 400 going to 800. This also helps cut back time from hand sanding, getting all those little scratches out, and it's just a nice process to connect the bevel to the edge of the knife. We now have our chef knife hand sanded to about 320 grit. Just a nice little hand sanding to get those horizontal lines out. Now I will take it up further once we get our handle profiled and whatnot, just to make sure that if we take any scratches or nicks or anything like that, it's not gonna lose us that much progress. I'll be able to get those out pretty easily with 320. Now for our handle scales, we'll be using this stabilized ironwood. I really like the way it looks. It's a nice dark wood. I think that'll go nicely with that really cool mosaic pattern. But with all that, we can go ahead and drill our holes and get the scales profiled. Alrighty, we have our scales profiled out. I really like how they turned out, but we can go ahead and hop back onto hand sanding and getting the blade finished up and ready to etch. Now with our knife hand sanded up to about 5,000, got it nice and cleaned off, we can go ahead and put it in the acid for our etch. Now we'll leave that in there for a full etch cycle, which will be about 20 minutes. So I'll see you guys then. All right, so it's been 20 minutes. We can go ahead and see what this pattern looks like. Holy jeez. Get it neutralized. That is insane. That pattern turned out absolutely fantastic. It kind of looks like a bunch of little snake eyes going up and down. I am just so excited right now. This is crazy. But now that it is out of the acid, we can go ahead and put it in some very dark instant coffee mix. We'll put that in there for about 8 hours, let it really soak in there, and that should make that 1095 even darker than it already is. Alrighty guys, so our knife is now out of the coffee, and you can see I wrapped it in some blue tape. What we're gonna work on now is the handle. We're gonna hop over on the grinder and trim down these edges, probably to about a 45 to 50 degree angle. And then we'll go ahead and epoxy them on the blade and get that nice and finished up. I will say real quick, the coffee did a fantastic job on this pattern. It looks incredible, and I can't wait for you guys to see it. So with all that, let's get this knife done. Now with the handles cleaned up a little bit, went ahead and scratched up the tang to give some more surface area for the epoxy to adhere to. We can go ahead and get the handles epoxied on. I like the Bob Smith Industries epoxy. It is a 5-minute quick cure, but I usually let it sit for 24 hours just to ensure that it is completely cured. Now I am going to be coloring it with some black graphite. I usually just use a straight black paint, but we're going to see how this black graphite turns out in there. And now we'll let that sit for 24 hours. 24 hours later, the epoxy has now had a full chance to cure, so we can go ahead, hop over on the grinder, and get these pins ground down, get the faces of the handle scales nice and cleaned up. Then we'll move over to hand sanding and work on getting this bad boy finished up. So now with a wicked sharp edge on the knife, I went ahead and made a nice little protective sheath out of leather, but we can go ahead and test the sharpness with some paper here, and that just cuts like butter. That is beautiful. I am super happy with how this knife turned out. I think the pattern looks absolutely wonderful, and I can't wait to give it to my client. I think they're gonna be just through the moon with how it turned out. With all that, it takes us to the end of today's video. I wanna thank you guys so much for following along and joining me on this Mosaic Damascus journey. I definitely learned a lot. It was a huge learning experience for me, and I had so much fun making it and jumping out of my comfort zone to get this wicked pattern. But with all that, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for following videos, and I'll see you guys in the next one.